Good afternoon. I'm Peter Friedman, co-chair of the Southwest Ontario chapter of the ICD. Welcome to today's virtual session, Sustainability and Climate Change, Bring Risk and Opportunity. Are you positioned for the emerging circular economy? I will leave the description of the topic to my colleague, Michelle Quinton, who will be co-moderating the panel and leading the discussion today. First, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Kitchener-Waterloo, we are on the Haldimand Tract, traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. The Institute of Corporate Directors offer education and training access for Canada, across Canada, for boards, aspiring directors, and company leaders in the nonprofit sector, the public company and private company space, and the government and institutional sectors. If you visit our website, you can explore and see the array of events, readings, and webinars available. Simply go to the icd.ca. At this point in time, in our virtual economy, it's an invaluable resource. And finally, I would like to introduce a fellow member of our chapter executive, Michelle Quinton, who will be co-moderating today's event. Michelle has served as president and CEO of Goodwill Industries Ontario Great Lakes since 2005, guiding the organization to $47 million in social revenue and 900 employees, while helping to propel thousands of individuals to overcome barriers, acquire skills, and enter the labor market. She has an illustrious list of engagements and community service on boards and foundations. Currently, she serves on the Fanshawe College Board of Governors, the Canadian Centre for Product Validation, and is chair of Goodwill Industries International Environmental and Sustainability Committee. Now over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting that. That was really nice. It was a bit old. I'm really thrilled to be here working with three incredible leaders who I believe got out way ahead on the issue of protecting people and planet. Three speakers that you will meet shortly, they'll be introduced, who have demonstrated that driving change is not just good for the environment, but good for business and good for brands. And I want to also say I'm pleased to be a part of the ICD and working with Jacqueline Lowen, who's going to co-chair with me, co-moderate with me, and also Gerard Seitz from the Ivey Business School, who is going to help coordinate some of the dialogue and chat that's going to go on today. I'll introduce a little bit more about the session, but before I do, I just want to set a bit of the stage. I would like to think that all businesses and business leaders do good, and that they recognize that by doing good, they can also do great. However, I think most of us believe that some equate doing good with doing well financially, and believing that pursuing shareholder value will itself deliver the best goods and service to the public, optimize employment, create wealth, which could then be put to all sorts of good uses. But this view is facing increasing pressure over time as environmental, social, and governance ESG criteria have risen to have more influence on decisions. How to allocate financial investment, how bright young workers choose where they want to work, desiring a place that reflects their values, or how the public at large sees the world with daunting problems, most notably climate change and economic inequality, and how they make consumer choices as consumers. Most companies today serve stakeholders as well as shareholders, and in so doing recognize economic value for their company and for society. Climate change or sustainability is perhaps the most obvious example of companies shifting their value proposition to doing good, becoming less extractive, more circular, more inclusive, committing to carbon neutrality, embedding ESG into their mandate. Companies are also realizing significant return on financial return when they do this. Whole industries are transforming right now. Think about the automobile industry as consumers are lining up for goods that are good for the planet. So today, while you're listening to the three champions' words of wisdoms, I would like you to consider three important levers that will influence the way you lead and govern. One, knowledge or trends, whether the science, the trends, the disruptions and disasters that appear to be climate related, or whether the media is influencing, no one can deny or miss the buzz about climate that is going on in our society today. And likely they can't help but think that the climate in which business is operating is changing. 2, consumer behavior. Consumers are speaking with their wallets and values as whole industries are changing through innovation to offer consumer goods that help save our planet. And finally, legislation. While the government can't make the change, it can induce it. End producer responsibility legislation, which places the onus on companies that produce products to be responsible for their full life cycle, is here. It impacted electronics years ago, and in 2023, Ontario is proposing to ban textiles from landfills while they introduce the same legislation. A repairability index is being launched in France right now, and as an effort to combat planned obsolescence, scoring products for their longevity, repairability, and how they recycled at the end of life. So apart from these levers, every company has the power to drive good. Look at what's happening with Major League Baseball right now as we're seeing a protest against voter suppression. So once again, today is about gaining perspective. You will listen to each of our speakers for 20 minutes, which will include a Q&A within that session. The chat room is going to be open for you to put your questions and thoughts into, and that will be moderated by both the facilitators of each speaker, but also by Gerard. And then we will break out into breakout sessions. Will be large, but I think they should be with each of the speakers, and we'll reconvene and do a wrap. So I would like now to introduce Jacqueline Lowen, who is co-facilitating with me today. Jacqueline is with UBS Bank. She's a new player on the ICD chapter with me, but mighty so far. And I'm really thrilled to be working with her on this initiative. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. That was a wonderful framing of the whole conversation we're going to have this afternoon. So with that, I'd like to say welcome, Nicole. I think you're in Vancouver. Is that correct?
I am. I'm joining you from the West Coast, and would like to, in the spirit of the traditional opening, acknowledge that I'm on Coast Salish territory.
Well, I'd like to welcome you to the Institute of Corporate Directors and our event on sustainability brings risk and opportunity. So first of all, I'd like to just give a bit more detail to you, Nicole.
Sure.
And Canopy is, it works with the forest industry's biggest clients and suppliers to develop solutions that will protect our last frontier forests. And Canopy is extremely well known for the greening of the Harry Potter books, which I think you're going to share with us, Nicole. And if anyone who's got teenage daughters, you will know H&M and Zara. And then there are so many fashion designers like Stella McCartney working with you at Canopy, Penguin Publishers, Globe and Mail, many more, which I think you're going to share with us. So what I'd like to do now is to take you, Nicole, and Canopy, and I'd like you to share with us your long view. I know you've got some slides for us, but what I'd really like to ask of you is to talk about the next 5 years. How will success look to Canopy? What will be your challenges? And with that, let me kick off to you. Thank you, Nicole.
All right. So if you don't mind, Jackie, maybe I can loop to that kind of question at the end. I think sort of part of what Canopy is going to be up to over the next 5 years will become apparent in kind of my comments, my opening comments. I do have some eye candy, as Jacqueline referenced, just because it's probably more interesting than looking at me for the next 20 minutes. So I will share my screen. And thank you all for this opportunity to be with you. It's a really exciting conversation and such a timely one. So really congratulations to all who have been involved with this topic. Coming to the ICD and for your focus on it. It's been an area that I've found fascinating over the past 22 years that I've been working in this space. So As Jacqueline already gave a little bit of a precursor or a teaser, the spoiler alert, a quick introduction to Canopy. We're a solutions-driven, not-for-profit organization. We are focused on protecting the world's forests, species, climate, and helping advance frontline community rights. And we do that by harnessing the purchasing influence of hundreds of the world's largest corporations. We currently work with about 750 large corporate customers of paper, paper-based packaging, wood-based fabrics like rayon and viscose, and pulp, companies like H&M and Penguin Random House, and the others that Jacqueline referenced, so I won't go into them. We are historically known for greening the Harry Potter book series, and we develop deep collaborative partnerships with our brand partners, helping them to develop cutting-edge environmental policies, and then working with them over years as they engage their supply chain to transform unsustainable supply chains to help kickstart commercial production of next generation solutions that are more circular in nature, and to actually help conserve forest ecosystems at scale. Now, as you may have picked up already, I'm from Australia originally, and Aussies are probably fairly well known for being sport obsessed. And one of the things that's lesser known about me is that I used to be a national level athlete in Australia. And so I've always had this fascination about the kind of inverse relationship that there is between sustainability and the Olympics. Now, when I was an athlete, like we all trained and aspired to be first across the line. And my experience, oftentimes when it comes to sustainability, especially over the last 20 years, has been that the first place spot is not coveted oftentimes when it comes to corporate social responsibility. That, people don't want to be left too far off the pace, but people are happy to be second, third, fifth, even maybe sort of even first of the B final. But the perception of risk associated with being first when it comes to sustainability has really kind of limited kind of leadership in this space. CSR, when I first started out in 1999, was oftentimes corporations fundraising for the local boys soccer club, or if they were really progressive, maybe even the girls soccer club. But there was no mention of Scope 3 emissions, decarbonization initiatives, circular economy, and there was definitely not sort of a race to the top or to be first across the line. When I first started Canopy, I was likely just shy of getting a restraining order from the number of kind of phone messages that I was leaving for people in the hope that sustainability would kind of pop as a priority and that they would call me back. And as we are all very aware, the world is changing, and it's changing very quickly. And this last year has really underscored how rapid that change is. Now, anybody who's reached for a scientific journal or even a mainstream newspaper in recent years has probably felt tempted to also reach for a glass of wine. Most of the news around environmental performance and health indicators are sobering at the very least. It's irrefutable that now that humanity is grappling with two parallel and interrelated ecological crises: climate change and the precipitous decline in biodiversity. And so that comes together to create economic instability, social instability, and we have experienced that in a very kind of tangible way this past 12 months with COVID-19. Now, 75% of new diseases that humanity is grappling with are crossing the barrier from animals to humans. Since 2003, we've grappled with MERS, SARS, Ebola, and now COVID-19. And so there's an acceleration of pathogens that are very virulent and that we have no resistance to. And that these pathogens are being released because we are disrupting kind of where they are currently safely hosted in intact forest landscapes. And they are then hopping from animals to humans with significant cost. And so that is the context of our times, and that's the context for running businesses in today's in the 21st century. And as we're all aware, the world has changed and the world is continuing to change. And so my perspectives will be more focused on what's happening globally in the marketplace, because that's kind of where our work is really focused. And I was really excited, Michelle, by your framing of those three areas, both in terms of knowledge and trends, consumer trends, as well as legislation, and young people that have been on the streets up until the last 12 months, but continue to be digitally online and active around climate change. They are increasingly voting with their dollars and with sustainability at the fore. And with that, we are seeing business leaders, if anything, over the past year, sustainability has become even more prioritized. There's a clarity within C-suite of most of the global brands that we're working with, that to be viable businesses, to be vibrant businesses in another 5 years, in another 15 years, then climate action has to be at the top of the priority list of business leaders, because otherwise there will be more social and economic disruption like we've seen this past year. Brands won't be able to secure the raw materials that they need to be able to even kind of produce the goods upon which their businesses and our societies are dependent. I'm going to give a quick example of a supply chain that's in transition. Canopy has been working with the fashion industry over the past 7 years. 7 years ago, we discovered that viscose and rayon fabrics were actually being sourced from high carbon, high biodiversity value forest ecosystems. It wasn't an intuitive link for us that something that could give you a splinter that stands tall and strong in a forest, a tree, can actually become that soft, silky fabric that's in your blouse or in the lining of your suit jacket. But there are, in fact, 200 million trees that disappear into rayon and viscose fabrics every year. That is slated to double within the next decade. And so for us, we felt what an incredible opportunity there is to deal with a big problem in terms of the world's climate and biodiversity and forest ecosystems, but also to proactively engage at this inflection point and to redirect the supply chain to be fundamentally more sustainable before billions of dollars of new infrastructure were built in exactly the wrong places, like in the middle of the Amazon or in the middle of Canada's boreal forest or the peatlands of Indonesia. And so we started reaching out to brands and producers at that time. And I'm glad to say that we've gone literally from 0 to 330. We have 330 plus, actually, brand partners formally on board with Canopy style commitments. Those brands represent $580 billion in pooled annual revenues. They represent big guys of the industry like Amazon and Target and H&M and Uniqlo and Zara, as well as pace setters like Stella McCartney and Kering. And because brands have been very consistent in sending message through their supply chain that they don't want to be sourcing from high carbon, high biodiversity value forests, that they want to be prioritizing the sourcing and supporting the production of next generation solutions. So fabrics that are made from fundamentally more sustainable alternative fibers like straw or waste textiles or microbial cellulose, and that they want to work with us and their peers to help conserve landscapes at scale. Because they've been sending that consistent message, producers that represent 90% of global viscose production now have similar commitments in place. And viscose producers that represent 52% of global viscose production are now verified with either a green shirt or at low risk of sourcing from high carbon, high biodiversity value forests. And so what we have here is essentially a supply chain. The global viscose supply chain has gone from the link between forest ecosystems, high carbon value forest ecosystems in particular, and fabrics almost being sort of unknown of, to now 52% of this global supply chain is now verified at low risk of being sourced from those critical landscapes and forest ecosystems. Now, of course, there's still 48% of the supply chain to shift, but essentially in the last 5 years, more than half of this supply chain has shifted. And that's exactly the scale and pace of change that we need to be seeing in these times. And I think what's happened within the viscose supply chain with Canopy Style is it shows that this scale of transformation can happen in years and not decades, which is what we'd previously thought. Now, of course, our work is always sort of looking to elevate. We are now working with brands in this turnaround decade to raise the bar of ambition, not just not sourcing from high carbon value forests, but also like really how can brands lean in and really help shift the dial on climate change and biodiversity decline. And so we're working with brands on very ambitious targets around, halving their raw material sourcing because of the transition to next generation solutions, sort of investing and using their political influence to really help drive conservation at scale. And this is totally in keeping with the times because we are in this turnaround decade for our planet and we have to protect 30 to 50% of the world's forests, according to the scientific community. Now, to do that, we can't continue business as usual. It's a big stretch from where we are today. And so Canopy has mapped out what that transition looks like. We've called it Survival, a pulp thriller, and it basically maps out how to replace 50% of the forest fiber that is currently logged to make viscose and packaging and pizza boxes and replace it with fundamentally lower footprint alternatives that are currently seen as waste, which is a completely human construct. That in nature, there's no such thing as waste. Things are part of a continuous cycle. And the fact that there are 26 million tons of textile waste in China and 92 million tons of straw burnt in India every year, leading to significant pollution across India and particularly in Delhi. These are squandered opportunities, feedstocks for the next generation of packaging, for tomorrow's clothing. And so the work that we did in Survival was map where those fibers are available and how to actually capitalize on them. And so this map is a little bit overwhelming on first pass, but it really just maps out one of the scenarios for where fiber is available, abundance of agricultural residue. Of course, Canada is primed to be part of this new green economy, but also where there's a preponderance of waste textiles that can be integrated back into the supply chain. And this is the scale of ambition that we need to be approaching these times with. These new technologies, these next generation solutions, they're not science fiction. They're here today. This is North America's first straw pulp mill that is used to make packaging. The world's first commercial scale dissolving pulp mill that takes waste textile to make next season's clothing is now under construction in Sweden. And the pulp from their commercial facility is already integrated into brands like H&M's clothing. And so I think that really underscores that this transition is already underway. And so for those of us that are in leadership positions, be it C-suite or in governance roles, it really, we need to be pivoting to meet the new market realities, both in terms of the millennial consumers' expectations, as well as the fact that the rest of the world is already transitioning. We see that old carbon accounting that left giant logging truck-shaped loopholes in legislative frameworks are being revisited because of climate science advancing so much. EU legislation is really being recalibrated with an action plan to transition to a circular economy. We see extended producer responsibility legislation on the books in many jurisdictions, both here in Canada as well as in Europe. And and the introduction of tax mechanisms. And so I think for from a governance level, making sure not only that you're just ahead of today's legislative realities because they're changing quite quickly. The imperative is, to go back to the Olympics analogy, is to really strive to be at the front of the pack, recognizing that there are many others that are grappling with this. You don't have to do it by yourself. There are many that are already quite far down this track and very willing to share lessons learned. But I think 21st century governance happens within the limits and the confines of our natural world. And I think it really requires a deep embracing of science and the fact that the rest of the world's markets are shifting. Looking at the business models that are being used and considered, and as well as supply chain impacts, requiring and incentivizing innovation and risk-taking by senior leadership of the companies that you're on the boards of is an imperative nowadays. And then, of course, gearing and prioritizing R&D and investment to advance next generation solutions to ensure that you don't have stranded assets, don't sort of like green light mills being built in the middle of, the boreal or a high carbon landscape. At this point, like, there just won't be a market for it. It will be an albatross around, or anchor around your neck. And so I think just in closing, I think if COVID has shown us anything over this past 12 months, it's really that we can change overnight, right? We can literally change overnight, and that in this turnaround decade, there is no more exciting place to be than in leadership positions with companies that have the ability to steer and change supply chains for the next 100 to 200 years to come. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. What a dynamic and exciting presentation. Very hopeful. I think you gave us the opportunities. So Bill Gates recently wrote an article in the Financial Times about climate change. And he said that before the planet's completely destroyed, we will innovate our way out of it, which I think you have really shown us that. But perhaps you could give us your take on Bill's comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a balance, right? Elon Musk has also issued a $100 million prize for the best climate technology. And I think as humans, sometimes we can have a little bit of a tendency to feel as though we just need a new widget or a new wadget to get ourselves out of the sticky kind of dilemma that we're in. Where we already have fantastic technologies available to deal with the climate crisis and biodiversity decline. It's called the world's forests and oceans. They're not an invention. They're natural systems. And I think what we need to do is we need to be accelerating and fostering the development of technologies that will help support a fundamentally more circular economy, so that we'll use things that are currently waste as the feedstock for, be it energy or fuel or clothing, pizza boxes and t-shirts. There's no reason for an 800-year-old tree to be cut down to make a pizza box or a t-shirt. And we need to learn how to live within the natural limits of our planet, right? And as leaders within our societies, we need to take into consideration the biological diversity and kind of bank account that there is, just as naturally as we do kind of social and economic factors.
Thank you so much, Nicole. With that, I'm going to hand back to Michelle.
Wow, that was breathtaking. Thank you, Nicole. I could ask you 1 million questions, and I look forward to getting into the break rooms later. But I now have the privilege of introducing our next speaker, Jeff Smith, who is the president and CEO of Elliston, an employee-owned, I think around $5 billion a year construction company right now, who just celebrated on April Fool's Day a week ago, their 70th birthday. And I know this because I follow Gain Inspiration, and I laugh a lot reading Jeff's famous blogs on the Elliston website. So you got to check him out. Jeff took over at the helm in 1996, and through a real redefinition of the traditional construction offering, he reinvented Elliston, and as a cradle to grave service provider with guaranteed performance outcomes through its capital services, facility management, and sustainable building divisions, growing to 5,000 employees across 15 national and international offices and becoming a leader in every sector and facet of the industry. I do know that Jeff's company is driven by values of trust, complete openness, mutual accountability, and entrepreneurial enthusiasm serve as the foundation. And these core values and the work that they've done, I could go on and on and on, have won them many, many awards. Aon Hewitt's 50 Best Employers, Deloitte's 50 Best Managed Companies, Canada's Top Employers, Waterstone Human Capital, Most Admired Corporate Cultures, and many of these awards more than once. And Jeff himself has won a lot of awards, and I think if I mention them, he's going to be mad. So I'm going to turn over to you, Jeff, to take us from here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. It's generous as usual, and unfortunately, I'm also the representative here today of a pretty serious carbon-producing industry, the construction industry. I just want to say, Nicole, I thought that was terrific. I'm going to say one thing about what you said in a minute, but the comment about the visual presentation is eye candy makes me very sad that I didn't bring any. So you're stuck looking at my ugly mug for about 10 minutes. I'll learn from you for next time. I just want to talk. I called it the new governance at Elliston, which is fancy sounding, I guess. I just want to tell everybody what I sort of see out there. Kind of a report from our ESG is the new, I don't want to say buzzword, but the new call out there, and from our front lines. I'm going to tell you what I see, and if it's okay with you, if you'll bear with me, I want to start with George Floyd, because when Mr. Floyd was murdered last May, a group of Elliston's Black employees just came together to talk about racism, about overt and systemic racism in the construction industry, and also at Elliston, and what needs to happen right here. What was great about it is they didn't ask anybody's permission. They didn't actually tell anybody they were doing it, and they just did it. And then by terrible coincidence, a few weeks later, we had some nooses discovered at one of our job sites in Toronto, and they were targeted very specifically at 2 Black tradespeople. It was about the most evil thing I've seen in my career. So I wanted to jump into action, but of course our Black employees were well ahead of me on the whole front. I just didn't know it, and it turns out I had a lot to learn about racism. Turns out so did our board. Long story short on this, we now have 3 employee-led teams, one attacking anti-Black racism, another attacking gender discrimination, and another attacking intolerance more broadly. And they are starting to look seriously at Elliston, at the industry, at overt and microaggressions. I've learned a lot about microaggressions, at equal pay, at promotion bias. We're looking at the broader community, including our learning institutions. We're sponsoring bursaries all of a sudden. We weren't doing this 6 months ago. At government procurement. It's really, really impressive stuff. But the question is, well, what's our board doing? And what's the CEO doing? And the answer is, we're learning. I've learned more about these issues in the last 8 months than I've learned in my previous 35 years. And our employees would say, that's okay. Those employees are the ones most affected by the problem. And what they want is for our board, first of all, to just listen and to learn, and then to follow the employees' leadership, and of course give the commitment and the resources to do what is necessary. Those 3 groups presented to our board at our March meeting, but they were actually giving direction to the board. I wrote down the words inverted governance here. It was terrific. It really was cool to see, and I'm seeing the same thing with sustainability, which is why I mentioned it. We know, I said a minute ago, that the carbon industry, or excuse me, I should call it the carbon industry. The construction industry is a big carbon offender. Bill Gates, in his book, says we need to go on this planet from 51 million imperial tons of carbon per year to zero. And the construction industry, both what we build and how we build, needs to find about 15 million of those 51 million. We're about 30%, about 30%. And it's a really complex thing to achieve. And like racism and intolerance, producing carbon, you have to get at it at every level. You have to get at it in design. You have to get into the supply chain. You have to get into it in the core materials like carbon and steel, which are frankly terrible. You have to get into the governments and the procurement. Because we're in a cost competitive industry, which doesn't lend itself. Bill Gates, if you read his stuff, talks about the green premium and right into our schools. We have to do the same thing. So again, I'm going to say to you, what is our board doing? We're one of the largest, as Michelle said, I'm not bragging, we're just one of the largest companies in Canada with a real problem. What are we doing? And I think they're doing their fiduciary, we too, I'm a board member, doing our fiduciary and moral obligation. They're coming to the management team, they're demanding to know what our goals are and what our plans are. They're putting us through our paces. I think that's what they must do. I'm not sure what else they should be doing. But the truth is, they're not the ones giving the orders here. I want to be really clear about this. We have these CEO listening tours where, of course, I go around and I listen to what all the employees are saying and answer their questions. And at every single session I do, I get this question. What is Ellis Don doing to address the huge carbon challenge and to get our company to a carbon-free status? Now, before I address that, let me be clear to you. The job I have at Ellis Don is to attract the very best people I can to the company and to keep them here. And if I don't have a solid answer to that question, these people are going to leave. The board, our board understands the urgency of the matter, but these employees, they're living the urgency. You know that, right? Some of these employees, I look at them, they look so young to me, but they've got kids. They look at their kids and this is the planet I'm leaving my kids. And by the way, I am not doing it. And by the way, Jeff, you better have an answer when I ask that question. It's the same inverted governance that we see happening. It's not the board, really. It's the employees. And again, that's okay. The board and the CEO are saying, listen, you're the ones who are going to deliver these goals and solutions. You're the ones with the brains. You're the ones that are going to implement them. So what we have to do is make sure you get the resources and make sure you have the power to do it. You tell us what needs to happen, and we need to let you make it happen. We'll give you the power to. I wrote, we'll give you kids the power. The head of our mass timber, which I'm going to talk about very briefly in a second. I go to him and literally he's 27 years old. I think maybe he's 32. I don't know. He's one of the brightest people I've ever met. This guy's going to change the world, not our 65-year-old board members. I believe that in my heart. So we've got to give them the power, and then we've got to get out of the way. And I really think that's the board's role, just to stand behind them and give them everything they need. So let me give you a little bit. Nicole did a better job than I will, and I don't want this to sound like an advertorial at all, but let me just tell you a few of the things we're doing here. One is we're getting going, right? First of all, we got to measure where we are. What number are we subtracting from as we make progress? That's not easy. The supply chain is complex. I got a whole bunch of excuses, but I'm just telling you, it's not easy. So we picked 2 or 3 projects, big, complicated projects. We're trying to measure where we are right now. Then we're going to set specific goals. We've set the goals, 50% emissions reduction in our own Ellis Don's activities by 2030, 40% cut in our embedded carbon, that's in our materials, and a 100% reduction industry-wide by 2050. I find that one a little bit thin, but I guess you've got to set a target. So first measure, set the goals, start working with legislators and clients and designers. It's funny, some clients, they don't know what to do. Let's be clear, our clients, and they're pension funds, they're very moral people, but they don't know what to do. So some of them are saying, you tell us what you're going to do to fix this. The smart ones are saying, how can we work together? But it's very interesting to see, because if we don't work together, we'll never get there. And of course, the legislators have to get there too. So we're pushing them and talking to them as hard as we can. And again, they're saying, you tell us what to do, right? Everybody wants to do it. I'm not getting any pushback there. we've got a construction sciences department, so they're pounding away with the steel and concrete industries to lower the embedded carbon. And concrete and steel are such terrible offenders, and it's really hard. But we're finding, the fifth thing I got here is we're finding immediate wins. And I think this is really important to publicize it. And I think Nicole was getting at this. We can do stuff, and we're doing it right now, and we can measure it and we can champion it, and that inspires people. On one hospital out in BC, just by changing the concrete mixes, we've saved over 6,000 tons of the carbon emissions associated with the concrete production, which they tell me is 1,300 cars off the road or 8,000 acres of new forest. I don't know if those numbers are exactly right, but it's the same thing. With people will be inspired to do more as soon as they see something happening. Mass timber, I mentioned a second ago, is a very big one. We're involved in 5 or 6 really large mass timber projects, and looking at a hybrid panel system to bring mass timber to really, really tall buildings. We've got a modular plant in Stony Creek. We're going to kick up 2,000 modules this year. That cuts carbon about in half, I think. And we've got a separate services division around energy production, not energy production, energy conservation and energy guarantees to get down to, you're probably familiar with passive house standards, to really cut down on the energy used to heat our buildings. But that's my list. And I'm almost done here. What's really important about every one of these measures, unfortunately, is that none of them gets us to zero. And if you've read your Bill Gates and the Uninhabitable Planet, if we don't get to zero, we don't survive. Here's what I think a CEO needs to do, because this is what Michelle always challenges me on. But I think that one thing I can do as a 65-year-old without the answer is to hire the smartest and most idealistic people available. I've got to get them here. Our board has to write them checks. And then the board and the CEO need to get out of the way. I have every confidence, like Bill Gates does. These people will get us to zero. I have no doubt about that. We need to let them. That's my goal. Michelle, that's all I've got.
That's not all you got. That was a wonderful reflection, Jeff. And, I was thinking of our conversation that we had earlier, and you talked about your new grandchild. And I found this old ancient proverb. I just want to read it because I think it's so true. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. So I think, Jeff, as I listened to you, I was going to bring up some issues around racism. I should have known better that you would do that and ask you some questions that, but I want to start with, wow, I could go on just about the whole pieces that you were talking about, but you did mention, or I did learn that you submitted a report to Mohawk College at the end of building the Joyce Center for Partnership and Innovation. And it was called The Journey to Net Zero, Lessons Learned. So I wonder whether you want to go there or not, but what are the biggest things that you've learned from what was standing out in that report?
Actually, I pulled down that report, and then I didn't read it. I did read it when it first came out. I want to talk to you for a second about what you said at the beginning, and I didn't work it into my speech, because there's a difference, and that's what I was trying to get to, between knowing something sort of intellectually, which is that if we don't get to zero, the earth isn't going to survive. And I knew this, and I was very committed to the whole idea. And then I had a grandson about 4 months ago, and I looked at him and I said, no, this is the kid who's going to get what I leave. Emotion trumpets intellectualism all day long, and we should never hesitate to appeal to it as much as the logic side. It's what hit me. Let me go to what I've learned about the journey to net zero is that it's not enough, which doesn't sound right, because when we talk about net zero with these buildings that we're building, that's about their operation, right? They create, they consume as much carbon as they create. You get to zero, that kind of thing. But there's no question that we used and emitted a lot of carbon in the building of those buildings throughout the supply chain. So to sit back and take comfort in this building, and we've got 5 or 6 of these under construction now that are net zero. I don't even think it's half the battle. So I think that the two things that what I intended dedicate the rest of my short time left in the industry and that are going to upend the industry is IT, which will be part of the solution, and sustainability. We need to change our industry completely from the design, but not just from the design, more so through the supply chain and the materials we use. And it's boring stuff. I won't bore you all with it, but there's a ton of work to be done here. So my answer is we should not get complacent with building net zero buildings, because they ain't net zero. As good as they are and as big an improvement as they are, and I don't want to be negative, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, I'm a bit of a junkie, as you know, around this stuff. There's a lot of talk about not being just at zero, but being contributing back from processes. And I think that's what you're touching on. And I wonder about your expert. You talked about having that great person. Describe that person who I think her name is Claire. What kind of leader does a board need to know they have in their company to make this go right? What's the background?
I'd be careful about saviors, Michelle. We have this. The interesting thing about this woman, Claire Ashby, who runs our sustainability effort, isn't her background or her expertise around sustainability, because quite frankly, she didn't have any. Although she'd worked in Africa, she'd worked on all sorts of not-for-profit stuff. Then she'd worked in the project finance area. What Claire Ashby is a brilliant young woman who's determined to do good in the world. And so what she does is she's learning all about it. Then she's teaching me all about it. But sustainability isn't something that I'm convinced of this, like racism, like safety, where you go, let's put somebody in charge and they'll solve the problem. It needs to be right in the heart and in the brain of everybody who's working there. They need to be thinking about it all the time. And the reason I mentioned that business at the Royal Columbian Hospital, where we saved 6,000 tons of carbon, whatever the number was, is because that inspires everybody else on the site to do more. It's got to be a collective thing, or we'll never get there. And so I don't know. I wouldn't try and outline for you a criteria for the savior within your company. I would say, as I said before, get really smart, really idealistic people. Get somebody to head it up, but they've got to be able to inspire everybody else.
So it's about character, and as we listened to Nicole earlier, Nicole made it clear her background wasn't necessarily how she sounds. She sounds like an expert, but her background is different than what you might expect. So I think it is about having the character, being a champion. One last quick question. You kind of touched on it, so maybe you push the equity in your company 100% to ownership by your employees. Tell us, will that give you an edge to meet your ESG criteria?
No, I'm going to do this real quick because I want to talk about something Nicole said the boards can do is really important, I thought. Anyway, the short answer is no. And as with racism, if we've got to motivate our people by giving them shares or doing whatever to not be racist, we've got the wrong people. If we need to motivate them and give them shares, don't get me wrong. I think it's a great way to have equity in the company. I think it's very moral. I think it creates a much better company, but not around the issues of sustainability and racism, because they're primarily moral issues. Look, I got to say this real quick. I know I'm over time. Nicole said something brilliant about people not wanting to be first. And that's what I found. And especially around racism, Ellis Don put up our hand and said, okay, we have a racist industry and we're going to fix it. And we immediately got our head shot off. We were immediately the racist company. And all our competitors said, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just duck below the manhole or the surface and hide? That's what they all did. One thing a board and leaders can do, because that's what this conference is about, is to give their management teams throughout the courage to be first. I think boards sometimes are too conservative. Nobody wants to see their name in the paper, but they can provide that courage and actually require that courage. Because I thought Nicole's comment was brilliant. I'll be quiet now.
Oh, I wish you could go on forever. I wish we had an hour for each of our speakers. But Jeff, I really want to thank you. This was brilliant. I do believe that you will be a first in short order on some big things, or like you have been most of Ellis Don's journey. So thank you for that. And I am now going to introduce our next session and speaker, Kelly Drenin. Kelly, are you there? You are. Okay. Hello.
Hello.
So Kelly is, I'm going to bring a really interesting perspective. What I learned early on about Kelly is she left a career, a big career in an industry, fashion industry, and became a real champion by creating Fashion Takes Action. She's a systems thinker, a thought leader, a disruptor devoted to making change within this industry, as we've just learned, that is having significant environmental impacts, including labor, energy, waste, water, and the use of toxic chemicals. So when Kelly created Fashion Takes Action, she had it in mind that she would bring together industry and brands and consumers to identify the barriers that exist to sustainability and help to find solutions. Kelly, I think, did the most brilliant thing a while back and created the World Ethical Apparel Roundtable, or WEAR, conference back in 2014, and it's now the WEAR webinar series. And in these 7 years, she has hosted hundreds of industry experts. I've been at many of these, not the expert, sharing practical insights to thousands of global attendees. She's a sought-after speaker, and most recently, she delivered a TED Talk as part of the global TEDx Countdown event focused on climate action. And also, Kelly was a recipient of the prestigious Clean 50 Award given to Canada's climate leaders. She was recognized for education and thought leadership and was the first recipient within the fashion industry. So Kelly and I are working together on a few projects, and she is going to, with Nicole and Jeff, going to change the world.
Well, thanks, Michelle, for that introduction and for inviting me to be here today and amongst this esteemed community of leadership, especially with Nicole and Jeff. I do have eye candy, so I'm going to just do that. Great. Okay. So yes, as Michelle mentioned, I am the founder of Fashion Takes Action. I created the organization actually out of the desire for a better planet for my children. So just to tie back in what Jeff was saying about his grandchild, we do work with the entire fashion system. As Michelle indicated, that means we work with industry and consumers to identify those barriers to sustainability and do what we can to remove them. So I hope that my presentation today will provide you all with a bit of a better understanding of the risks and opportunities that exist in the fashion industry, the direct impact that this can have on consumer trust, transparency and profitability, and what board members can provide in terms of ESG oversight. So there's 100 billion garments made every year. Fashion is a $3 trillion industry, and globalization has allowed brands to outsource their massive supply chains to countries with little to no environmental or labor protections. I keep losing the, there we go. So there's the many problems facing the industry generally fall within these 5 areas. So on the social side, we have human rights and labor issues. And on the environmental side, water, chemicals, carbon, and waste. And I apologize for the banging that's you might hear in the background. I have renovations happening next door. These issues can and do pose financial risks to corporations. Consumers are asking more questions and demanding for more transparency. Innovators are rising to the challenge, and brands can't afford to have their heads in the sand. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about each of these challenging areas and why it is critical for corporations to respond. Starting with water. The fashion industry is the second largest consumer of water globally, and water scarcity is increasing. Making our clothes uses roughly 37 million Olympic-sized swimming pools of water every year. Consider that most industry manufacturers are located in regions where there's high baseline water stress. This can lead to disease and social unrest. And it's estimated that the industry is responsible for 20% of all industrial water pollution worldwide, most of which comes from the textile dyeing factories or facilities that are located along riverbanks in developing countries, often with hidden pipes. Moving on to carbon, the carbon footprint of fashion is enormous, maybe not quite the same as buildings or transportation,
but it's up there. And it's estimated to account for 8 to 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Some estimates say that a t-shirt can travel 35,000 kilometers before it lands on your back, which is almost one trip around the world. And further, if a brand is manufacturing in regions like, say, a country that's part of the Paris Agreement, then they may be introducing some new carbon taxes or cap and trade programs, which will make it more expensive for factories to operate in those regions. 342 million barrels of oil are used to make our clothes, primarily for synthetics, so fabrics like polyester, acrylic, nylon, and spandex, which are derived from crude oil and actually make up 70% of our wardrobe. Polyester production releases about 1.5 trillion pounds of greenhouse gas emissions every year. And moving on to chemicals. Unlike the nutrition facts that we see on food labels, clothing just doesn't really have a conveniently itemized list of ingredients. This could be because it requires about 8,000 synthetic chemicals just to make our clothes. Cotton is not only a thirsty crop, but conventional cotton is farmed using a significant amount of pesticides and fertilizers. Pesticides, of course, are known to pollute both surface and groundwater, which impacts biodiversity. Interestingly, BlackRock recently announced that any companies they invest in must understand their biodiversity risks, which is a considerable step in the investment community. Denim and leather are two of the most toxic fabrics that are made for fashion, from the synthetic indigo dyes and the distressing techniques used to make our jeans, to the heavy metals that are used to tan leather. All the while, the people who are making these clothes are exposing themselves to these toxic chemicals with little or no protection. Which brings me to labor and human rights violations in the fashion industry, starting with safety and working conditions. So here is the factory fire from Tazreen in Bangladesh that killed 117 people. These factory fires still exist today. In fact, just a couple of months ago, there was another one in the same region. And then, of course, the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory, also in Bangladesh, that killed 1,100 workers and injured thousands more. Forced labor and modern day slavery is rampant across the fashion industry. You might be familiar with the situation that's happening right now in the Xinjiang region in China, where 80,000 Uyghur Muslims have been forced to work in factories and farms that supply cotton to many of fashion's high street brands like Adidas and Calvin Klein and Nike. Finally, overproduction and our overconsumption results in 92 million tons of waste going to landfill every year. The equivalent of one garbage truck of clothing is landfilled or incinerated every second of every day. So where does this all come from? Well, consumers, have a large responsibility there, because the average person now only wears a garment 5 to 7 times before they're done with it. And actually the average Canadian puts about 85 pounds of textiles into the garbage every year. And in a recent waste audit analysis that we did at Fashion Takes Action, we determined that amounts to about 500,000 tons of our used clothing and household textiles going into Canadian landfills. But of course, the industry is also to blame. So a lot of the waste comes from, 15% actually of industry waste comes from the cutting room floor, simply because it's just, throwing these scraps in the garbage, the cost of that is minimal. And then now, retailers make it so easy for us to buy 3 of something in 3 different sizes and send back the ones that we don't like. But this is creating a huge surge in online returns, and it's flooding the warehouses and the distribution centers. And eventually it's just going to make their way to landfill, because oftentimes the cost or the value of the returned garment is lower than the cost to actually examine and restock that item. And in January 2020, some of you may recall, a Toronto resident literally stumbled across a number of clear plastic garbage bags in front of Dufferin Mall, filled with the cut up merchandise from Carter's and Oshkosh. Allegedly, an employee was probably tired of being asked to destroy this merchandise before then dumping it into the hidden dumpster behind the mall, and instead decided that, hey, maybe this should actually be made public. And Sadly, this is common practice, and legislation has come up a couple of times already today, and something called the duty drawback is not really helping in this situation, because it basically gives retailers incentive to destroy goods that they cannot sell. That's a whole other conversation, though. So why should any of this matter to corporate boards? Because companies that exhibit good performance on ESG issues like waste reduction, innovation, and fair wages are better able to manage their risks, costs, and to leverage opportunities. Value is tied to reputation, and how ESG issues are managed can either negatively or positively affect public perception. So I'd like to give an example of this with fast fashion e-tailer Boohoo in the UK. This is an example of how ESG risks, particularly when neglected, can have a negative impact on a company's share price and reputation. So their reputation took a pretty big hit when flaws in their supply chain were brought to light through the Times and the Sunday Times last year. So they discovered that factories in Leicester in the UK were making clothes for Boohoo, and they were accused of paying the workers, I think it was £3.50 an hour, so less than the minimum wage, and having very poor standards of health and safety. And then even a few days later, it was released or revealed that the factory conditions of these garment workers were put at risk of COVID-19 infection. Shortly after the findings of an independent review commissioned by Boohoo were published that identified many failings in the Leicester supply chain and recommended improvements to Boohoo's related corporate governance, compliance, and monitoring processes. Following the publication of the independent review, Boohoo's CEO commented that the group had to bring in new board members with ESG experience. While they tried to reassure the market that it would strengthen its governance and internal processes, it's difficult for any company to undo the damage of serious allegations of misconduct. Good On You is the world's leading source for fashion brand ratings, and it's used by hundreds and thousands of consumers. And in many cases, it's what fuels public demand for transparency. As you can see here, Boohoo was rated as not taking adequate steps to ensure payment of a living wage for its workers. And it was also given a not good enough environmental rating for a number of reasons. Given the negative media attention that was garnered by the Boohoo scandal, the share of the price of the company was inevitably impacted. And this graph shows how the company's share price plunged. On July the 6th, Boohoo's share price dropped by approximately 23%, which was just one day after the news broke about the worker exploitation. And to date, it remains down despite the fact that the allegations have yet to be proven. The market response to these issues and the public demand for ever more scrutiny means that corporations worldwide should be paying more attention to these issues in order to continue raising ESG standards across the board. Okay, so despite all of the challenges that need to be addressed, there are an incredible amount of innovations that are happening within the fashion industry, from circular economy models and transparency tools to bio-based and regenerative fabrics, a reduction of hazardous chemicals in supply chains. Brands are setting science-based targets and measuring their impact. Innovations in labor, however, a little slower to emerge, but there are some technological developments now to trace supply chains and capture worker voice. So it seems that the fashion industry is now at a turning point, and companies who are still not convinced that ESG performance matters will really find themselves irrelevant in no time at all. Where we've seen the most movement in recent years, and I echo what Nicole was saying about in the last 5 years, and we see that this is doable, but we've seen a lot of movement in circular solutions for fashion. So new opportunities for reuse are emerging as rental, repair, and re-commerce. And there's been a number of startups now that are developing textile recycling technologies, automated sorting systems, and radio frequency identification. And there's a lot of brands that are starting to partner up with these startups and do some pilots. And hopefully soon we'll see some of this scale. Now, while reduce and reuse are, of course, the most important, and recycling is sort of the last resort, it is still exciting to see the advancement in technology and science to address the growing piles of our clothes that are in the landfill, which has a direct impact on climate change. We hosted, and we might get into this a little bit later with Michelle, but One of our Wear webinars that Michelle had mentioned before actually featured 3 of the top recycling innovators. And they were all together on a panel, which was unique because normally you'd sort of see them, one of them at a time, maybe speaking. And so it was really interesting to bring them all together because in some way they are, competitors. But what was really interesting that came out of that was that they all agreed that there's so much to do and there's enough room in this space for all of them and more to be innovating in the same space. So that was really interesting. And then many fashion brands have joined the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Make Fashion Circular initiative to demonstrate their commitment to solving fashion's waste problem, particularly given its direct relationship to climate. And so I'd like to finish by just talking about one publicly traded or publicly listed brand that has been making strides to address this challenge, and they have been mentioned prior by Nicole. So say what you will about fast fashion and its direct relationship to the mess that we are in. But if it isn't going anywhere, then brands like H&M have, they must be taking the opportunity to demonstrate leadership. And I thought it was interesting how it's come up a couple of times already today about this sort of race to the finish line and being the first. And I do commend H&M for continually doing this and to be out front of a lot of these issues. And despite the fact that there's a lot of risk associated with that and a lot of scrutiny or accusations of smoke and mirrors or greenwashing. But looking forward, they do have a goal to be climate positive by 2040 through energy efficiency, the use of 100% renewable energy, circular business models, and nature-based solutions. And then looking back just at their 2019 report, they collected 29,000 tons of garments through their in-store take-back programs, diverting about 145 million t-shirts from the landfill. And I also think that they're part of Canopy's green shirt system there. They also used 96% renewable energy in their own operations and saved 32.7 billion gallons of water through sustainably sourced materials. And for years, they have actually been investing heavily in circular technologies, particularly in textile recycling. So in addition, they've actually ranked pretty high in the 2020 Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and they've actually ranked the highest on Fashion Revolution's Transparency Index. In contrast, Boohoo was one of the lowest. So, undoubtedly the pandemic has had a huge negative impact on sales for the entire fashion industry. But if we look at sort of pre-COVID, the H&M Group did see global growth with net sales increase by 11%. H&M's chair of the board has attributed the company's success to the best combination of fashion, price, quality, and sustainability. So just to end things, the fashion industry is clearly facing many risks, but equally there's a number of opportunities. It's not out ahead of the issues and has a big mountain still to climb, but there's a lot of opportunity here. And ultimately, it comes down to having a strong environmental, social, and governance proposition links to value creation in a number of ways. And also ESG risks can have a negative impact on a company's share price and reputation. And companies should really proactively integrate ESGs into their business models, as stakeholders are increasingly evaluating a company's supply chain from this perspective. Finally, it is most critical that brands have ESG knowledgeable people on their boards. And it's just the courage to be first. Thank you.
Kelly, thank you. Thank you. That is an eye-opener, an industry that really needs to obviously transform. And thanks to people like you and Nicole and companies like H&M are doing it. I want to just touch on a couple of things. One really quickly around this notion of circularity. As I listen to you and I want your opinion, and I hear you talking about companies that are doing fiber regeneration. So I know this to mean that they can take a garment and do a process to it, and fiber comes out, they remill it, and new fabric gets made without any extraction from other resources. Apparently, a lot of these techniques are quite in and of themselves very sustainable. What is your opinion about what's going to happen then with the fashion industry? Is it going to get reclaimed in places like North America? And move to a more ethical and reasonable place in places like Asia or other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of Canada and what we're capable of doing today here when it comes to textile recycling, we can only really do mechanical textile recycling. That infrastructure does exist, and by mechanical I mean like actually shredding and tearing apart textiles, and then oftentimes those are downcycled, right? So they're actually maybe needle punched and felted, or made into some sort of a non-woven product. So from a sort of bringing back or reshoring of manufacturing for the fashion industry, I don't think that that's going to happen via mechanical recycling. But I do think what's interesting, and when I mentioned H&M and the investment that they've made among some other brands, is in the chemical and hydrothermal recycling technologies. And so there's a lot of R&D that still has to happen. This is not close to scaling. Ultimately, the dream would be, yes, to see something like these facilities operating in Canada, numerous facilities operating in Canada. I know one of the innovators, Worn Again, based on the number of just post-consumer textiles, as I mentioned, that are in our landfills in Canada, there's enough feedstock to run 12 of their facilities in Canada. So, there's a lot of potential. There's still a lot more work that has to be done. We just actually finished a textile recycling feasibility study for Environment and Climate Change Canada. Literally just sent it off on Monday. So there'll be some interesting findings that come from there, and there's a lot of recommendations for the government in terms of policy and investment in further infrastructure. So it will be an interesting space to watch over the next 10 years. But I was chatting with I won't name the brand, but a big Canadian brand. Whether or not, they saw something in 10 years, 15 years time where we could actually take one of their articles of clothing, mechanically recycle it, and regenerate it and make it into, would they be interested in that happening in Canada? And of course, there's an appetite there to see that kind of thing happen, but it also comes down to the economics, unfortunately.
Wow. So, I think this is maybe a good transition time to the breakouts. I want to just pay attention a little bit to the chat room here. There's a question that has been posed, and there's been some great emphasis and talk all the way through these three speakers on ESG in that broader sense, and mentioning of measures and criteria. And the question is, does the Institute of Corporate Directors offer a director competence in this area? And I think it looks like the answer that's coming up is not yet, but we're working on it. I also want to, as we go into the breakout sessions, indicate they'll be a bit shorter, which I think is okay. It's just an opportunity if you have dialogue. We will have to probably use the chat. We've got quite a number of people in this session, so they'll be large. Although I think if you raise your hand and ask a question, that'll work too, but maybe both can go. And we have placed a question into the chat room at the top that you can talk about, or you can go in whatever direction you feel comfortable with. This one is also touching on ESG. And the question is addressing sustainability or climate-related risk and opportunity an imperative for a board, and why or why not? What incentives or measures can a board use to drive change in this realm? So I'm going to end before we go into the chat room by thanking the speakers once again, thanking Kelly for that incredible eye-opening presentation, Nicole really setting the stage and sort of bookending what happened with Jeff. We see real on-the-ground action in a company, a big company. It was, in my view, it was a perfect example of how to lead and how to champion and how to govern in this new reality of climate and sustainability, really changing the way we all need to behave. So we're going to go in. The breakouts will be a bit shorter. That question's at the top of the chat room there if you want to talk about that. It's a bit of a random thing, so have fun with whatever speaker you end up with. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a great conversation in your breakout. I know we did. We coined first of all, we sang happy birthday to Alice Stein. No, we didn't, but we did really like the concept of this being the turnaround decade. I'm just going to give a few highlights and then turn it over to Gerard here. And we really got into, the concept of measurement and how do you really know if you're trying to do the right thing, like invest or make decisions that are scientific in nature. There's just so much going on, but we felt very excited about the fact that this is really an opportunity era and a time to really take this whole realm of sustainability seriously. I was just intrigued by a conversation between Elliston and Western University, and I don't know if I can call on one of the two of you, maybe now I'm forgetting her name. I should have wrote it down from Western to comment on the building you're building and what's going on with that cool development on the campus.
Lynn,
sorry, I just can't find where I wrote it. Lynn, please.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So I was just saying that as we were talking about getting to net zero, so Western is actually in design and on the street right now, or will be soon, with our first net zero energy building and paying that green premium that you need to do in order to get that. And actually hoping over time that becomes a net negative energy project. So certainly not in the embodied carbon or in the construction, but in the operations, as we were talking earlier. And getting net negative by actually tying in other buildings to a geothermal field we'll build as part of that building, as well as the fact that we're underway with feasibility studies for a full and a larger scale geothermal facility at Western as well, to tie into planned renovations that will take place within our medical precinct at Western.
Thanks, Lynn. Sorry about that. I mean, we've met before and I can't remember my own kids' names half the time, but that's exciting. And the other thing, just to wrap up what we talked about, was really the whole field of investment and trying to make, as I mentioned, those right decisions ourselves, but also what's happening with the bigger world of investment. And I think we talked about is the money lining up with the innovation? And we all felt encouraged that, yeah, this is the time when we're not only going to create the innovations, we're going to have the investment. I think, as was demonstrated by Kelly's group and Kelly's conversations. I'm going to turn it over to Gerard and Kelly to that group to give us some notes on what they talked about in their breakout.
Sure, I can start, and Kelly just fill in the missing pieces. I apologize to Michelle. Michelle, we kind of put the main question that you posed to us to the side, right? But anyway, let's put it. So I would say at least 4 themes. Terry asked the question around, okay, so in North America, we're, generally speaking, fairly smart people, very well educated. So what to do about all of this? And so we talked a little bit about, of course, there are no easy answers, but as with many of these intractable problems, it requires a holistic approach. The public, the private, the not-for-profit sector really have to come together. And so, Kelly gave us a couple of examples where that actually worked, in the sense that it created some impact, some punch. And so most of the systematic changes, will only come to the forefront if we get the perspectives of different stakeholders that are at the table. And of course, that requires a lot of leadership around an expert facilitator as well. Am I paraphrasing that correct, Kelly?
Yes, that was great, Gerard.
Okay, all good. And if you want to just add on, just let me know. The second key insight was spurred out of a question and observation from Jody, and just going back to this issue that consumers are not always fully informed, educated, etc. It's not purchasing awareness, because if we only had purchasing awareness, things might be very different. That led to some discussion as well, because awareness is not always necessarily action, right? And so I made that point in business school. I made that point with my young kids. Things happen once they leave us, right? So. But what's really and of course that's one of the things that Kelly is doing, working with young people, and hoping that we make a difference. But the thing that was really intriguing came back later in the conversation was the full transparency through QR codes. And again, Kelly, if I misrepresented, just let me know. But through these QR codes, you can actually now actually get an understanding, right? You can trace the cotton back to the farm. You can learn a lot about the carbon footprint, water, etc. And so, if you want transparency, you got it, right? And might that somehow inform the actions that we take, the purchases we make, etc. The third major theme, Patricia and John, was around kind of the governance piece, skills of the board. Jeff, you talked about that. Jeff, you made me chuckle a little bit because, the kids are going to change the word. The board's perhaps not so relevant, right? Let the kids do the job. But of course, we talk a little bit about the board and how to get those enlightened people. Either you recruit them or you develop them in terms of the skills and expertise, etc. Now, of course, and this was Patricia telling us about an organization called Competent Boards that actually does provide an ESG designation. But, that program just started. There's not a lot of people around that bring this enlightened perspective, have this deep experience, etc. And so, John as well, and I think, John, I would agree with you, because to me, that's the essence of good leadership anyways, is to never lose this deep sense of curiosity and always, keep asking the tough questions. And if anything, that might help us go forward, become better leaders and contribute to building better organizations with better boards, etc. But that's a real issue. What are we going to look for in new board members, and what does ESG look like? And then finally, as a question around, what story are we telling the street, so to speak, and how create this momentum? I think Nicole, you showed this picture with young people, right? Always young people with these boards in their hands and protesting, etc. And a few years ago was this about a year ago, really interesting story in The Guardian about this real tension between young people that want change, radical change, and then a kind of an older generation. Hold on, not so fast. So, which takes us all the way back to what Martin Luther King once said, right? Because hold on, not so fast almost always means no change. And so what's the story that we can share? Because I think somehow this is about kind of momentum, this platform, the urgency, etc. And so I think where we ended up was, well, you need those defining moments. You need specific turning points that are sometimes given to us, but there's also things that we can do. And so Kelly talked a little bit about the work that she's doing, hosting conferences, facilitating conversations, discussions, because at the end of the day, appetite, sometimes it grows organically, and slowly we see people waking up, and simply that waking up might create some forward momentum. That's it, Michelle.
That was wonderful. What a great overview. And I'm glad you have notes, and I'm glad you could remember the names. I'm going to turn it over now to Jacqueline, who's going to sum up their group and also is going to put the wrap for all of us. So as I turn this over, I just want to give a great heartfelt thanks out to all who participated, and definitely to our lead champion speakers and to the organizers who made this event happen. So over to Jacqueline, and bye for now.
Thanks, Michelle. We're into the last 5 minutes, and with our group, it went into 3 categories. First being governance, and the whole comment around the organic process happening at Ellis Don, and that the culture developing there, if they're not, the talent is not afraid to lead, but that honestly comes from the leadership. The second point really is about measurable goals. And, with climate change, it's quite obvious we don't have all the answers. We loved the story of looking at the grandson and what world am I leaving you? So, what can we do? Let's encourage doing, not just talking. And that's what we're seeing today, is that that's definitely happening. And I think one of the big points brought up was human rights abuses. The boohoo story with the measurement of wages and treatment, and pretty shocking. So I think with this whole measurable goals is, let's just start it, get it done. It's going to be wrong, but let's get started. That was the big message coming out. The third point was, and this was a big question, is who is leading the charge? And Nicole really stepped in and talked about how the brands are doing it. And because they have a long-term trajectory, they want to be sustainable, they want to be robust, versus the election cycle, which we won't go into that more. But the final point about it was leading the charge is that boards, if they need to step forward now, and they want to start addressing this to remain relevant. And that really jumps into quickly summing up the points from the speakers, with Nicole talking about, people don't want to be first on the podium, which I thought was a very thoughtful perception. It's the risk of sustainability, but what's the risk of not doing it? Right now we have this, and Nicole writes in a blog, I recommend you read it, that we have this unprecedented shutdown of the economy, which will require a rebuild. And it is an opportunity. Jeff Smith talked about the 30% carbon from the construction industry. And he's talked about what is the board doing? So where is the power, which we've already sort of mentioned, but I really liked his comment about, you want to get the most talented employees, you better attract them with your culture. And lastly, with Kelly Drenin, very true, the comment about fashion is outsourcing to countries without regulation and transparency. They're just outsourcing all their problems and issues. I love the comment about BlackRock now asking for transparency. And then, the H&M versus the Boohoo and the human rights story, that the fact is H&M is getting it right. We do have hope there. And then finally, I wanted just to do a little shout out to Pina, who asked about the ESG certification in the messages. And with that, over to you, Richard, to close it up for today. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Jacqueline. And my particular thanks to everybody. If I started mentioning names, I'd always fall short. So I'm just going to do a collective thank you to everybody. It takes a lot of effort on everybody's part to make this happen. The speakers, of course, and then the ICD team behind it. So thank you to all. The big takeaway that I had was it's all about education. Everybody needs a little bit of education to get through this. So we all need to have better skills at the board level. And hopefully it's these sessions that are giving you exactly that. So please, this is one of the largest turnouts we've had. It's been great to see everybody here. I look forward to seeing you at future events. Keep track of both on our website, but also watch the emails that are coming in because we have some exciting sessions coming in the next few months as well. So again, my thanks to all. And just a reminder, you will be getting a survey on this. It is very valuable to us. The results that you feed back to us help set the executive team on their path to doing a better job for you. And that's been our goal all along. And hopefully through the surveys, you can give us the feedback as to whether we're accomplishing that or not. So thank you very much to all. Take care and have a great afternoon.